And let's see, I got to give Steve. Where are you, Steve? There you are. So, all right. There's a recording going on. Sorry about that. I forgot to give Steve Cordts, he's our waterfowl specialist out of the Bemidji office of the DNR. Give him the presenter role there so he can share his PowerPoint. We also have Dave Scott with us today from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It's a cool relationship we have between the federal government and the state government. So, Steve, we're just seeing your screen there. If you're not the PowerPoint, it's just your screen with the event on it. So. There we go.
Try again.
So, like I was saying, we did a waterfowling is one of those things. It's not something, if you just getting into hunting, just going through firearm safety, and you decide, I hear people waterfowl hunting. It's not something you just want to, grab any old firearm and go out and try. It's not necessarily an entry level sport to get into. I guess I like to think of small game hunting as kind of the entry level to hunting. We did a great talk on that a couple weeks ago. But so this program is going to be more on how ducks are managed and surveyed and whatnot, and the relationship we have with the state of Minnesota and the federal government. So Dave Scott is from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. You want to introduce yourself quick, Dave?
Sure, Benji. So I am Dave Scott, and I'm the Mississippi Flyway representative for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in our migratory bird program out of headquarters. I had the privilege a few years back of actually living in the Twin Cities area, working at the regional office in Bloomington. So I know what a lot of great opportunities are right there locally, and enjoyed my time there. I worked for the Ohio DNR for 25 years, where I was the wildlife chief, and I have served on the Mississippi Flyway Council, both as a technical section representative and a council member in the past, and now as the representative from the federal government. So I've had opportunity to work with Steve in several different roles. And so look forward to our conversation today.
So Benji, can you see my screen yet or not?
No, I'm not seeing it.
Ah.
Right before you. There, I'm seeing your screen, Steve. If you hit the presenter mode on that.
There we go.
Perfect. Well, Steve Cordts, he's our waterfowl biologist out of the Bemidji office, like I was saying, and he's kind of our local waterfowl expert. So I'll let you introduce yourself, Steve.
Yeah. So I've been a state waterfowl biologist in Bemidji for, I guess, 18 years now, and I guess have the privilege of having our past two state waterfowl biologists still up in Bemidji. So we've got probably 60 years of knowledge between the three of us, and we still all talk on occasion. So it's been a big benefit to me to have those two up here in Bemidji with me. But I think today I wanted to talk, I probably should have titled this like Waterfowl Management 101, and kind of stress the relationship between the states and the service, and talk about a fair amount of cooperative management in terms of how we manage ducks and geese at the flyway and state level, and also a bunch of the different monitoring that we do via surveys and banding, harvest estimates. I don't think I'm going to talk much about habitat or enforcement, but there's also cooperative management that the states and the service do, and then kind of end with a little bit on hunting info. And if you're new to hunting, how you can get into it, where's the information and things like that. So kind of an outline and a quick overview. But to start with, in terms of flyways, there's 4 flyways in North America. Those were all set up based on duck banding data that dates back to the 1930s and how ducks migrate north to south in the US and Canada. And it was a system set up in the early 50s to try to manage ducks differently than, you know, a state might manage upland game birds like pheasants or ruffed grouse, because they're going to migrate north to south. And the flyway, I guess, management program or process essentially sets the same seasons for Minnesota basically has the same duck season as Louisiana or other states in our flyway, based on both harvest and hunter numbers and things like that. So it's much different than upland game birds, but it's worked for probably 70 years, and that's kind of how we manage ducks and geese. And I think for a lot of that management, the huge benefit for waterfowl is we have a lot of data. And this slide kind of shows breeding waterfowl surveys that have been in place since the mid-1950s for the North, South Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, north into Canada, and east into the US. I've highlighted Minnesota, but because we do our own waterfowl survey here, but Michigan and Wisconsin also do. And all of that is cooperative efforts to get estimates of breeding duck numbers during the spring for pretty much most of the breeding or best breeding waterfowl habitat in North America. And to do that, it's pretty standard surveys that I fly here and the Fish and Wildlife Service flies. They're low-level fixed wing surveys. 2 people in a plane. We count ducks in wetlands on quarter-mile wide transects across that map I just showed in the last slide. And from that, we can derive estimates of abundance for both ducks and wetlands across much of North America. In Minnesota, this is a map for survey area I fly. I don't fly the entire state. It's about 40% of the state. The number of survey transects I fly differ a little bit based on wetland density. I didn't put those on the map here. But again, it's pretty standard methods, both here in other states and across North America. And from that, we can derive estimates of total duck abundance. And this shows estimates from the North American survey that go back to 1955. I think the key point is just the variation in abundance. You can see in the early 60s, mid to late 80s, pretty low numbers of ducks, roughly 25 million. Some recent years in the maybe mid 2000s, even recent years close to 50 million ducks. So a wide range and variation in terms of overall duck abundance, based on most of that's based on wetland abundance, but just a wide range of up and downs in terms of duck numbers. In terms of Minnesota, our survey numbers, just back to 1968 through 2019, you can also see the pretty wide range of abundance from low numbers of ducks in the late 60s, early 70s, pretty high numbers in the mid 90s, early 2000s, and maybe the last 10 plus years kind of near that long-term average, but also pretty high variation over time, and that's also based on wetland abundance, probably more than anything else. And those wet or duck estimates, we use those within, I guess, the flyway system, and with states and the flyways and the service to have come up with 3 different duck regs packages, restrictive, moderate, and liberal, with different season lengths, different duck bag limits, different, same opening days, but we've kind of used that and structured that within a modeling framework called AHM to set up and look at user monitoring data, abundance, wetland estimates, some modeling work to set up packages for hunting. And those packages then apply to all the states in the flyways. And that's been in place now for 25 years. We've also used duck banding, again, a cooperative effort between states and the service and folks in Canada to band ducks. We look at or use the banding data to look at movements of birds, estimate harvest rates, estimate survival rates, and all states in our flyway ban both ducks and geese. And again, the service and Canadian Wildlife Service help with that, and a very cooperative effort to get pretty useful data that we can use and sort of plug into our annual monitoring and, I guess, evaluation data. As far as harvest, again, that's monitored annually. I guess I think the next slide talks about the Harvest Information Program in HIP, and that's what we use to estimate total waterfowl harvest in states and the flyways in the U.S. We also can estimate hunter numbers for that, and through what's called a wing bee, we can get species-specific harvest estimates that I'll also talk about. But so the HIP program, I think most hunters probably know about this a little bit, and it's required for anyone to hunt migratory game birds in any state in the U.S. And it's a simple series of questions that are asked at the time you buy your license. And in Minnesota, it's do you plan to hunt any migratory game birds in Minnesota this year? And then we ask about how many ducks, geese, woodcock, or dove did you harvest last season? And then did you hunt coot snipes, rails, gallinules? Yes, no. And that is not the harvest survey. It's simply screening questions to identify groups of hunters to actually send the survey to. And so from those questions that we asked for duck hunting, for example, if you look on the left, so if you said you didn't hunt ducks last year or hunted and shot 0, the Fish and Wildlife Service will mail out a survey to about 1 in 100 Minnesota duck hunters to estimate their harvest this year. And if you hunted last year and said, yeah, I shot more than 10 ducks, we survey those folks at a much higher rate. And 1 of maybe 10 of those hunters get the actual survey. So we mailed a survey form, a pretty simple form in terms of we asked the date you hunt, the county, the state, and the total number of ducks, geese, et cetera, that you shot. So the HIP kind of puts people in groups or strata, but that's not the survey. And this is the actual survey that is mailed to hunters. And that's where we get harvest estimates every year from. And in addition to that, the Fish and Wildlife Service picks a sample of hunters in every state, and they mail envelopes to those, and they participate by submitting a wing from every duck they shoot, and a wing tips and tail feathers from every goose that they harvest every day of the season. And from that, we can get estimates of, well, species-specific harvest and age and sex of the birds. So it's another example of a cooperative effort between us and the service, but also provides that species level and age and sex of harvest for all ducks in North America and at the state level. And in Minnesota, our harvest is pretty diverse in terms of species composition. Only about 30% of our harvest is mallards. That's been consistent for decades now, but we also shoot fair numbers of wood ducks, blue-winged teal, ringnecks, green-winged teal. But compared to some other states, there's states south of us where maybe upwards of 80% of their harvest is mallards, and we're much more diverse. I think because our habitat is more diverse here. We have some hunters that tend to favor dabbling ducks like mallards. Some hunt diving ducks, ringnecks, scaup, things like that. So again, probably based on our habitat and our hunter effort more than anything, but pretty diverse in terms of our overall harvest of ducks in terms of species. And I think that probably the biggest driver of the harvest in any state is total numbers of duck hunters. You can see here, this is a Minnesota state waterfowl stamp sales that go back to 1977 through 2020, I think. And if you look like back in the 70s, maybe early 80s, we probably averaged about 140,000 duck hunters in the state. In the last maybe 10 years, we've been around 80,000, maybe a little bit above that, but roughly half of what we were in the 70s. That's not unique to Minnesota. There's a lot of states that have lost lots of duck hunters, especially states in the upper Midwest. And we're trying to do things to maybe bump up hunter numbers if we can, but again, the duck seasons in Minnesota have been pretty much the same for 25 years in terms of overall season length. So we're losing hunters even though the seasons haven't changed that much. In terms of waterfowl hunting, just to maybe point out a couple of maybe resources that people can use, and maybe a couple of changes that we made this year in terms of waterfowl regulations. I think the biggest one was we opened a teal season this year from September 4th through the 8th, 5-day season. If you look at the map here, all the states in the Mississippi Flyway have had teal seasons. Some that go back into the mid 60s. Minnesota is the only state that has not had a teal season. And if you look to states west of us, most of those states have also had teal seasons. And North, South Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, have had bonus blueing teal seasons, which allows 2 bonus blueing teal early in the duck season. They've had those in place for a few years, but Minnesota this year opened a 5-day teal season. We have to evaluate it. It's experimental, and the season's over now, and we've had pretty good reports from it. But again, it's year 1 of a 3-year experiment to look at hunter compliance and harvest and hunter effort. So I think that's the biggest change in terms of waterfowl regs we made for this fall, but that season's already over. In terms of like hunters, hunter information, if you're a new hunter, things like that, there's a whole ton of resources I think people can look at from our DNR webpage on access to land on our recreation compass. You can look at that. I send out and compile a weekly waterfowl migration report. It gets posted every Thursday about 3 o'clock in the afternoon on our webpage. Or I can add you to my email list when that the report gets mailed out. There's a bunch of other resources in terms of like Google Earth, Onyx, DU post hunting reports, all sorts of info like that that hunters can look at or get if you're a new hunter or kind of new to it. Or again, you can certainly email or call me and or Dave, and would be happy to like try and help out any way we can with any info on new hunters or any of the data or reports that I kind of talked about before. So
Great, thanks, Steve. So if anybody has any questions, excuse me, please put them in the Q&A section there. That would be great. Some of those links that Steve talked about, I put it in the chat there. I also put a couple in there from Dave from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They have a great waterfowl website or link on their website. So those first couple links are from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But one of the things I like to talk about, and we talked a little bit the other day, Steve and Dave, was how it isn't exactly an entry level sport getting into duck season. You get boats, you got dogs involved, you got calling involved, you got decoys involved, waders, and I mean you can go on and on about the stuff you can take out duck hunting. And I kind of started duck hunting on a local farm pond down by Red Wing there, and I had a friend that had a boat we could get out into the backwaters of Mississippi and stuff. But I'm just, when I got a dog, when I got older after college and came back, I started just jumping ponds, finding public land with ponds on them, and doing that. And that was a great way to get into the sport a little bit. And I had a dog that could swim, so I could send him out after the birds, and hopefully I was a good enough shot to get one or two here and there. But some of the HIP regulations and stuff. Dave, do you want to cover a little bit more about how that in Minnesota, at least, that's one of those things when you go buy our license, we have to say, yes, I'm going to hunt migratory birds, and then we fill out that HIP report. And that's not necessarily a federal thing, but every state is supposed to do that and report back to the feds. Is that right?
Yeah, Benji, Steve covered it, but I can, I guess, expand on it a little bit. Now, every state is implementing the HIP program, the Harvest Information Program. The Fish and Wildlife Service federally receive the data from the states. So we coordinate that effort and we compile the data and use it to come up with those estimates of harvest for migratory game birds. So a state like Minnesota, they, through their licensing system, implement the HIP program by having hunters basically declare, are you a migratory game bird hunter or not? If you say yes, then there's a series of questions that help the state and the Fish and Wildlife Service later put you in different strata. Strata is like, a category of you are a duck hunter or you hunt geese, you're very avid because you harvest a lot or you don't harvest very many, that information gets transmitted from each of the 50 states to Fish and Wildlife Service headquarters in our harvest surveys section. Those biologists and statisticians take that information and use it to draw samples of hunters. So you haven't really completed the survey, as Steve mentioned, but you've identified yourself, and we've used that to categorize your activity level. Then a sample of those folks in each state are actually sent the survey form to say, what did you actually do this year? You may have said, I'm a migratory bird hunter, I hunt ducks, I got less than 10 last year. Well, maybe you had a great year this year. You get sampled, you get the survey form, you fill it out, and we have that for, hundreds of folks across the country from each state. That gets combined so we can get those estimates of total harvest. And that information is really important to combine with the banding information that we have, with the wing survey that gives us age composition, species composition in the harvest. All that gets fed into a variety of harvest strategies and models that are used to help us determine what is the optimal regulation package for species across each of the flyways next year. So that's a very cooperative system. The states are participating. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on the federal government side is participating. Our hunters provide that critical information. So we really appreciate the folks who receive those surveys to actually take the time to fill them out.
So one of those important things we got to do is, as hunters, to make sure we manage the population the best we can. So we appreciate the federal government taking the step in guiding that. It's a pretty cool system, I think. So we did a great question from Aaron on, is duck hunting possible without a bullet blind, dog, decoys, and all that? He's interested in learning how people get into duck hunting gradually, and also how that might differ from hunting birds like geese. Either of you want to chime in on that?
Let Steve take that one.
Yeah, I've said for a long time, I think you could duck hunt probably with a pair of knee boots and no decoys, and just with a little bit of scouting and a little bit of like poking around the countryside, or you can kind of escalate to $20,000 duck boats and hundreds of decoys. But you certainly can shoot ducks with probably minimal effort and without a dog, either jump shooting or pass shooting, or maybe just with a couple of decoys. And I certainly can try and help him or her with that. I don't probably know the area that they live in that well, but again, they can call me or look at our, some of the online stuff for access to places, public land, private land, and kind of the same with goose hunting. Geese are pretty visible in terms of like their feeding. This time of year, they're out in small grain fields, hay fields. If you can find a field where geese are feeding and hunt there the next day, they'll probably come back, and you probably have a good chance of shooting some geese that way. But yeah, I'd certainly help them or try to like point to some locations. But again, it's a lot of it's I think on the back of the hunter of kind of poking around their own area and doing scouting. That's to me the biggest thing. You have to spend some time driving and like scouting lakes, fields, wetlands.
I know with goose hunting, it's kind of nice because you can you get a lot of geese that settle down in farmers' fields, and there's a lot of farmers that don't mind the opportunity to get rid of a few of them. So if you can find
Right.
a willing landowner that's got a bean field or a cornfield that they're harvesting, you can sit out there and cover up with corn sacks or hide behind hay bales and stuff. You might not even need a decoy. They're not going to land in water, so you don't have to worry about getting wet for it. it's one thing I did enjoy about jumping, finding small ponds and getting up and trying to get the ducks out. If you don't have a dog or a way to get in that water to get the bird back, that gets to be part of the problem, is trying to get them when they're flying out of the pond so that they land
Right.
on the ground so you can find them. So I'm sure every duck hunter's probably got stories about getting a little wet trying to swim out there to get a duck that they downed and it was a little over their waders or something. But and another good point you brought up, Steve, was, the recreational compass is great. We have a ton of maps on the Minnesota DNR website. If you go on there and just search up maps, but there's a lot of areas called waterfowl production areas and waterfowl management areas that are open to hunting. You do have to use non-toxic shot in all waterfowl hunting, so we got to make sure we point that out. We had a discussion last week when we were kind of practicing this, Dave, about getting out, grabbing your pheasant vest or something and walking out there and accidentally having some lead shot in there because you're hunting a different property. Got to be cautious of that. It's non-toxic only on all these properties for waterfowl production properties. So, but they're great for. I actually have one about 8 miles down the road that's got 3 little ponds on them that are actually flooding this year in the drought for some reason. The water is about 4 feet higher than it has been in the last 5 years, which is kind of strange. I don't know what's going on there, but it does bring a lot of opportunities. I'm actually hoping there's going to be a lot of ducks here because of the habitat expanded a little bit, so a lot of weeds and stuff along the edge, more so than there has been in the past. So, but check those areas out, Aaron.
I was going to say, Benji, when I was in the Twin Cities and hunting with some of the other Fish and Wildlife Service staff and going to those waterfowl production areas, the WPAs in west of the Twin Cities, you might go out there because there's grass and you're hunting pheasants, but you notice that there's ponds and creeks and other little wetland pockets, and there's waterfowl out there. And yeah, they provide a lot of opportunity. And so that's one of the ways that, like Steve talked about, you can decide, like, maybe there's a spot that I normally hunt that I think about as a pheasant spot, but I could take up waterfowl hunting and give it a try. That's that easy entry. You find some spots like that. But I did in Ohio, as I started off with, I owned a Chesapeake Bay Retriever. Now figure out where I could take my dog hunting and learn. And eventually you hunt with some other super avid hunters who are better skilled at calling. You've learned to identify ducks. You have the non-toxic shot. The regulations, and then you get the waders, and then you start buying decoys. And there's a lot to it, but you can sometimes go with others and have that kind of entrance into the sport, decide that you really enjoy it, and then you can take it to whatever level you want.
That kind of leads us right into our next question. Rachel asked about any mentored guided hunt opportunities for ducks around. And James, I don't know if you want to chime in. We don't do any through the outreach section of the DNR yet. In my mind's eye, someday it'd be great if we could do this and do some mentored hunts. But I just got a call from a gentleman who's getting out of the hunting. He's getting older, and he donated a bunch of his decoys and stuff to the Red Wing Wildlife League down by Red Wing because they do some youth hunts and mentored hunts down there. So check around your local. I don't know where you live, Rachel, but check around. My advice, I guess, would be check around your local area and find somebody that hunts ducks. If they got a duck boat sitting out in their driveway this time of year, that's a good place to go. Hey, if you got an extra spot or could give me any tips, ask him. Most of them are pretty darn friendly. Any of your Ducks Unlimited chapters in the local area, if you have a lot of waterfowl in the area, that's a good place to go too. There's going to be probably a Ducks Unlimited chapter or something like that in the area. In local conservation clubs like the Red Wing Wildlife League, the one I was just talking about down in the Red Wing area, isn't necessarily a Ducks Unlimited chapter, but they're their own little wildlife league. They have blinds set up out there. They do let people out there to use them, and they do some mentored hunts. So check out those resources too. So if you have any other ones, anybody
Benji,
else?
I would say that, a great way to network for hunters like that is, go to a Pheasants Forever banquet, go to a DU banquet, help raise some money for conservation, but also meet a lot of people that are local, network with them, as well as your local conservation club. And I'm sure that plenty of them would be more than happy to provide those opportunities for someone with an interest but no experience.
Yeah, to answer the question directly, we in outreach, we don't have anything set up for a mentored learn to duck hunt like we do for deer right now. That's part of the vision moving forward. We're trying to expand some of those opportunities, but the COVID, the public health circumstances that we've been in since March of 2020 preclude us from really getting folks together and doing this stuff. So we're kind of in a little bit of a hiatus, and we're trying to do as much as we can virtually and remotely. But ideally, we would be getting back into that as the public health conditions allow and we evolve moving forward. So it's definitely on our to-do list. I'm not sure when we will have the resources to make that happen. But yeah, it's something that we're considering along with other small game opportunities and pheasants. And there's a lot of stuff that we're really trying to get into. And the thing about I'm seeing Aaron follow up with being located in the Twin Cities. Or at least I hope that was Aaron that said that. Yep. I keep saying it, here in the Twin Cities metro. I'm not originally from Minnesota. I'm from down south, and I've lived in a bunch of different states. But I've never seen as much opportunity at my doorstep as I have living in the Twin Cities metro. I mean, I can see the skyscrapers of downtown St. Paul from my front porch, and within a 45-minute drive, I've taken turkey, I've gone goose hunting, I've gone mourning dove hunting, I've gone deer hunting, I've harvested wild rice. I mean, I've foraged for morels, ramps. I mean, it's just, we have a tremendous amount of opportunity, and we have a tremendous amount of public lands that you can try this stuff out on. And honestly, the first duck hunting I did in Minnesota was and folks have alluded to it. Dave's alluded to it. Steve's alluded to it. I was on a pheasant hunt, and we were hunting a marsh because pheasants love marshes. They love cattails. And there's a stream draining that marsh, and we jumped puddle ducks. And because we had non-toxic, because I hunt with non-toxic, and then you don't have to worry about, do I have a lead shell in my vest? It's like it's if you never use lead shells, you don't have to worry about taking them out of your vest. And it was the duck season lined up with when we were out pheasant hunting, and we were going for a mixed bag, and it was a lot of fun. So there's a lot of opportunities. My 2 cents on how to find other people to do this stuff with. Pheasants Forever, the critter groups are great. Pheasants Forever, Ducks Unlimited. Some of the broader stuff, Backcountry Hunters and Anglers is another group that they've got a lot of active folks that are here, especially in the metro. There's a very active chapter in the state of Minnesota. You might want to reach out to them. And then online, there's so much information that's out there right now, and we're all so connected. I mean, finding folks online is not, it's a lot easier than it used to be. So even if you don't have a direct link to them, if you're seeing folks on Instagram that are posting pictures about their duck hunts, or you're seeing stuff on Facebook or Reddit. I know Reddit has a very active hunting community on it. These are all great places to pick people's brains and to say, hey, I'm new, I want to learn this stuff. Can somebody help me out? And be prepared for a deluge of information, and you're going to ask 20 duck hunters what the best way to duck hunt is, and you're probably going to get 40 different answers. So just be ready for that. And the good news is that the woods and the marshes and the ponds, it's big enough to figure out how to do the stuff that best works for you.
Good answer. We're always learning, even as experienced hunters, or even I know guys that guide fishing, and they pick up tricks here and there too. So we're always learning. Rachel had a question on there: any tips and resources for learning duck ID? And I think Steve might have talked about a little bit with his early teal season. Some friends I was talking to in southern Minnesota were out on the teal hunt, and they missed several teal because they wanted to make sure of what they're shooting at. And Dave, you pointed out the number one rule of firearm safety: you make sure your target, right?
Absolutely.
So, and I'm not for sure. I think Craig put a little link in there about some resources. I remember, Dave, I don't know if you know or not, but I think it was the federal guys that had a website or a link that had different birds in flight. And that's always my tricky thing. I can ID a bird when it's sitting in a pond in front of me or on a pitcher, but seeing birds in flight come in is hard to identify, and that takes some experience of getting used to. Do you know of a resource like that, or?
Well, I mean, obviously, there's the University of YouTube that has all kinds of stuff, and you can go to Google and search for those types of things. The Fish and Wildlife Service at our migratory, bird page has a variety of resources and links for identifying a whole host of birds. But it's one thing, as you mentioned, very important that so I can tell mallard when it's 10 feet away. But what do they look like when they're flying and it's lower light conditions and the weather's bad, or they're in a mixed flock and I need to pick them out? So I recommend looking at those videos. Minnesota may have on the DNR webpage some information. The Fish and Wildlife Service certainly does, but go to YouTube, go to Google, look for those videos under like real circumstances that you can encounter and just use that as practice. And then, you can go out during times of the year when the birds are around, but it's not hunting season, and practice. That's the best way to do it.
That's a great point, Dave. And I mean, especially this time of year, I've seen skeins of Canada geese coming down the Mississippi, and they're going right over downtown St. Paul. And, the migration is going to be starting up here. Keep your ears open. You hear a quack or a honk, like look up, see if you can identify what's going overhead. Practice on the real life stuff. We've got a lot of opportunities to do that without needing to be out in the field at dark 30 with a gun and not sure what you're looking at. And then the other thing I'll say about that is, if you're not sure, don't take the shot. It's a lot. It's kind of a bummer when a mallard goes by and you're like, oh, I could have taken that. It feels a lot worse to take a duck that you're not supposed to take than to pass on a duck that you could have had a shot at. So just be sure what you're looking at, be sure what's behind it, be safe, be smart, and you'll get it done.
And one of your famous things, James, is the 5 Bs. One of those being binoculars, right? So if you're out, scouting for stuff right now, this is a great time to be out and start seeing some of those ducks come in and look at their flight pattern. Teal are smaller birds; they flap really fast, and use your binoculars to get a good, solid identification on them. And it's just that practice is gonna prepare you for better things down the road for sure. So.
Yeah, and the 5 Bs that Benji's referencing, those are the things that if you're just getting into this, there are places where you don't have to pay premium price for things, and there are places where I found that investing money in it is worthwhile in the long run, and those are my 5 Bs, and it's binoculars or glass. Anytime you've got glass or optics that you're using, I found that paying a higher price for a higher quality item works better in the long run than going cheap on it. Boots, if your feet are wet or hurting, you're not going to have a good hunt. Bullets or ammo, non-toxic stuff tends to be a little pricier, but that's the cost of doing business these days. And I mean, ammo is a completely different story this time around, because it is hard to find. If you can find it, get it, because it is hard to find. Start looking now. So bullets, binoculars, boots, bullets, base layers. I invest in my base layers. I personally like merino wool. It's lightweight. It keeps me warm. It keeps me out there. It keeps me comfortable. And then I'm forgetting what the 5th one is because I wasn't thinking about it. So I'll have to go back and revisit
that one either. So there's another good question in the Q&A there about people going out from friends and from personal experience and not getting permission from landowners that just don't want to give you permission to go hunt their land. And I think that's a kind of a common thing. I run into that once in a while. There's one I used to drive by on Highway 3. I'm like, this would be like the perfect place to go goose hunt. There's always geese out there, and they had a big sign, no goose hunting. So it was kind of obvious. I didn't have to go bother to ask and get turned down. But he was he's asking about why doesn't the Fish and Wildlife Service or the DNR create a program for local farmers to plant some of the crops, give chances to hunters? That, does that play into our walk-in access program a little bit? So, I don't know if anybody wants to expand on that at all. In Minnesota,
maybe provide a Minnesota perspective, but there are a lot of states that have those walk-in type programs. So you figure out where's their public land, where are their wildlife refuges that have hunting opportunity. But private land in the Midwest, is the bulk of what we have. So it's relationships that matter. So it takes some work sometimes. Go back to that question earlier about, I'm new to the sport and I want to get experience. Well, when you meet people, that's one of the ways to start establishing those relationships and finding places to hunt.
Yep. Definitely. In Minnesota, we have a walk-in access program here where when you buy your license, they can ask you for it, or you can ask the license agent about it. It's a $3 permit, and it's a cooperative agreement between the state and local landowners that will allow hunters to come out and hunt on their property. So I would definitely check that out as a way to find property that may not be, it's not public property, it's still private property, but you can buy a $3 walk-in access permit for that and be able to have access to some of that property. And that's a great way to expand some of those resources too. So, and I would say if you are looking for, we're talking waterfowl today, if you're looking for waterfowl, there's a lot of public land in areas you won't really think of, especially along the Mississippi River, that are backwaters, you consider backwaters of the Mississippi River, that is owned by a city or other public entity or the federal government that may not be the best posted, but do some research, do some scouting around, and there's opportunities to get into some of these places for sure. So.
Benji, it looked like there was a question in there about the decline of license sales in the late 80s. Steve, do you want to talk about that? So the question's from Kyle, and it says, what happened in the late 80s that caused state waterfowl stamp numbers to drop so quickly?
Yeah, a couple things. We had low numbers of ducks, but probably more importantly, we had 30-day duck seasons with 3 duck bag limits. So both a decline in total numbers of ducks and a reduction in the season, we saw about a 6 or 8 year period where we saw a big drop in duck hunter numbers, and probably more to do with the shortened season than duck numbers. But again, that's kind of, I think I mentioned different regs packages for ducks, liberal, moderate, restrictive, and at that time it was a restricted duck season, and that's and hunters dropped out, I guess.
And I think across the board, we've experienced a decline in hunters in a lot of things, and ducks and waterfowl hunting is definitely one of the bigger ones, I think. So, and just again to remind people, I did put links for both the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, a couple of their resources for waterfowl hunters in the chat, and also put the recreational compass from the DNR in there, and our waterfowl page where Steve mentioned he had a weekly waterfowl report. That link is in there too in the chat. So click on those if that's something you want to explore later and learn more about. Definitely do that. So anything else? I didn't see any other questions, James. If you see any other questions,
I've got a couple of chat notes. So here's a question for Steve and Dave. Are duck populations cyclic like grouse, or is it strictly kind of a habitat limiting factor for those that flashy population number trend?
If they're not cyclic, so they they do follow habitat conditions. You may have, drought and wet cycles in the prairies that drive those things, but largely it's based on a habitat quantity and quality.
Nice. And then, so there's a couple of these that came to me. Does Minnesota still have redheads, canvasbacks, stuff like that, or are they all gone?
Yeah, we still have breeding redheads and cans. They're not that abundant, but I don't think we've seen any declines in those in terms of breeding numbers, but there's just not that many to breed here. And in terms of fall abundance, we've probably seen a decline in terms of fall abundance on some of our what used to be kind of historical lakes, Lake Christina, Huron Lake, that used to hold a ton of cans. Those numbers aren't there. Certainly haven't been there in recent years, but in terms of our breeding numbers, they're still here. And continental breeding numbers of both redheads and cans are doing well. They just don't seem to stage here on certain lakes like maybe they did in 40s, 50s, 60s.
Nice. And then the last one that came to me was, what is the oddest species of duck harvested in Minnesota? So like what's been one of the most unusual individuals that have come through? Is there anything that sticks out in y'all's minds about like they just all of a sudden there was a harlequin duck that showed up, or some sort
I've got a story about that, and it was a harlequin duck, and I get paid to ID ducks, and I'm pretty good at it. And I had a harlequin duck fly through my decoys. This probably 10 years ago, and he flew through 3 times. It was a lone male, and I didn't know what it was. And he was probably at one point 10 yards above me, and I didn't know what it was. And he swung around 3 times and eventually landed. And when he landed, I figured out what it was. And I don't shoot ducks once they land, or I don't flush them up. But like a doggone harlequin duck, the first one I had ever seen in Minnesota. And I watched him swim around for a little bit, and then he got up and flew off.
So that's
nice.
a great example of knowing what you're shooting at before you shoot it. Even Steve had something that was extremely unexpected, and you just don't shoot it because you're not sure.
Yeah, Steve, I can't believe I mean, I just pulled harlequin duck out because I've done waterbird work over in Asia, and it was just it's always been a very conspicuous duck to me, but I know it's not supposed to be over here. So that was really funny. That's the one you saw, and it just happened to be the one that I pulled out of my hat. So.
Then we actually do have a couple shots in Minnesota every year, or I hear about a few shots. So, they're pretty rare, but yeah.
That's funny.
I did get one in the chat sent to me about the, what is jump shooting or pass shooting? And I don't know if my definition's correct. I think of it as, I'm coming up to a small pond or an acreage, and I'm trying to scare ducks off of that and get them to fly so I can shoot at them, versus being out there in a boat or in a blind and trying to get them to come in to me and land. So I guess that's how I think of it. So.
Yeah, it's whether you're sneaking down a creek, coming up on the edge of a wetland, but you're more actively looking to encounter waterfowl while you're moving around between various, spots that might have them, versus setting up in a blind and calling and putting your decoys out and trying to attract them to come to you.
I got my little duck call here, and I'm horrible at it, so I won't demonstrate it, but there's a definite art. And like Dave said, the University of YouTube would be a good resource to learn how to call some ducks, but I definitely have more success at scaring them away than I do calling them in. So.
But while you're waiting if you have any other questions, I will mention that everybody who hunts migratory game birds, ducks and geese, required to have a federal duck stamp. And the actual art contest for next year's stamp is going to be held Friday and Saturday virtually. And I think Benji gave you a couple of links that you could provide, but folks wanted to see the artwork, the entries, or if they wanted to actually watch the judging, there's an opportunity to do that this week.
Yeah, I did put that in the chat also. So go there. If you've never seen some of those entries and the judging going on, it is pretty cool. It's pretty amazing. And I think you were saying earlier that Minnesota is one of the top states for artists contributing to the stamps.
Distribution, there's like 137 entries, I believe, that are going to be judged this week. And I don't remember the percentage, but the state with the largest percentage that were entered came from Minnesota. So very active artist community for waterfowl there.
Dave, we're coming up on the last couple minutes, but could you just explain why we have a federal duck stamp? Like, why do we need to buy it?
Back in the early to mid 30s, there was the Duck Stamp Act, I believe is what it was called, that the Migratory Bird Hunting Stamp Act, 1934, signed by Franklin D. Roosevelt, basically required, that was the Dust Bowl days. Habitat conditions were poor, there was a lot of drought. And that stamp generates income for, those funds are used to buy wetlands and to preserve habitat. So like my office is here in Ohio, in the Western Basin Lake Erie at the Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge. A fair amount of the several thousand acres of the refuge were purchased with duck stamp dollars. There are a lot of waterfowl production areas that we were talking about earlier that were purchased with duck stamp dollars. So I think it's like 98% of the funds that come from buying that conservation stamp are used to buy and preserve habitat. And there's been, check the website that I have on this other computer beside me. I can tell you, it's like $800 million, or it's a large amount of money that has been generated from the sale of those stamps over 90 years. So it's required, but it's a great thing for conservation. It's one of the best conservation programs that we have. And a lot of, the Mississippi Flyway, which is Minnesota's part of that, a lot of those dollars are being spent in the prairies, North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, that are basically that breadbasket production area for waterfowl that our hunters enjoy. So a lot of return on those bucks, and it's also great artwork. Wonderful art that gets generated, and people sometimes just collect the stamps or collect the prints from the contest. It's the only federally sponsored art contest. That's pretty cool.
Yeah,
That's
I
awesome.
think with that, that's a great segue to close the show out on. Get out and support the efforts of the federal government and your state governments to support waterfowl and waterfowl conservation. The stewardship part of our series is definitely taking care of that stuff. So I think with that, I'd like to thank especially Dave and Scott for coming on our program and sharing your wealth of knowledge with us. We really appreciate you doing that and taking the time for that. And thanks for everybody who joined in. Again, my name is Benji Cohn. James Burnham's on with us, and Dave and Scott. We're going to end the recording, and we'll go back to the practice room and sign off on everybody else. So hopefully see you on the next Moss program. Everybody tuning in, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks, everybody.